Hello everyone and welcome to Creature Archives. Today we're continuing the series Evolved Fiction. In this series I take iconic creatures from movies, myths, and games and reimagine them through the lens of real-world evolution and biology, seeing just how close real life could get to turning fantasy into reality. In today's episode, we're stepping back into the monsterverse to bring to life perhaps the most benevolent kaiju to ever grace the earth, Mothra. We'll look at just how big a flying insect could realistically get, dive into the amazing symbiotic relationship between this species and this channel's realistic Godzilla, and explore how real-life biology could produce a form of resurrection. As I already sort of laid out in the intro, in order to create a real-life Mothra, I have three primary goals. First, this species must be the largest flying invertebrate in history, and not only that, it must be a member of the order Lepidoptera, which is the group that includes all moths and butterflies. Second, the species needs to have a symbiotic relationship with this channel's realistic Godzilla, Thermoradiosaurus colossus. Usually for these videos, I completely separate how each species evolves from the other creatures we've explored in Evolved Fiction, as I want these to each be a species that could independently evolve in real life. However, for this episode, I thought it would be a disservice to Mothra to not have that connection to a Godzilla equivalent, as that is a pretty core aspect to her character. And finally, this species will need some form of resurrection, some sort of biological mechanism it uses to cheat death. Across her many portrayals, Mothra consistently demonstrates the ability to lay an egg that hatches into a near-exact duplicate of herself. This regenerative ability, along with Mothra's benevolent nature, is part of why I thought it would be fitting to feature her episode around Christmas. Themes of rebirth and goodwill are central both to Christianity and to the holiday in general, and they align perfectly with what Mothra represents and with how Mothra acts. So with that, I hope you all have a Merry Christmas, and let's get into the episode. Now usually I would start with the first goal, breaking down the general body plan and explaining how the creature gets so big. But in this case, we actually need to flip that order, because before we can talk about size, flight, or anything else, we have to start with the symbiosis. Without it, this species simply couldn't exist at the scale we're going to describe. Lepidoptera, the group that includes all moths and butterflies, first appeared in the early to mid-Cretaceous, roughly 140 to 130 million years ago. These early species were small, mostly nocturnal, and already specialized. Adults fed on nectar, pollen, and plant sap, while caterpillars often relied on specific host plants. In this scenario, the ancestors of the Mothra lineage diverged from other tropical coastal moths during the late Cretaceous around 80 to 70 million years ago, along the warm, humid shores of the Indo-Pacific. These coastlines were dominated by mangrove-like vegetation, tropical jungles, and chemically active, irradiated beaches, environments that would later become critical to both larval development and adult behavior. It was here that the earliest interactions with coastal theropods like Thermoradiosaurus began. At first, these interactions were likely incidental. Adult moths may have been attracted to resting dinosaurs to lick salt deposits or trace minerals from their skin, behavior very similar to mud puddling in modern butterflies. But over time, natural selection began favoring moths that could tolerate the chemically harsh residues produced by Thermoradiosaurus, and eventually, those that could exploit them. While Thermoradiosaurus obviously has evolved adaptations to survive usage of its own chemical weapon, those defenses weren't perfect. Repeated use of this weapon produces high concentrations of hydrogen peroxide and metal-catalyzed free radicals. These compounds accumulate in the mouth, throat sacs, and surrounding tissues, causing chronic inflammation, tissue damage, and gradual corrosion of the catalytic structures that make the weapon work. Left unchecked, this would reduce the dinosaur's lifespan and the long-term effectiveness of its atomic breath. This is where our moth lineage enters the picture. These adult moths evolved salivary secretions and proboscises rich in catalase, peroxidases, and metal-binding proteins. When feeding on residual oxidants and mineral deposits from Thermoradiosaurus skin and oral tissues, these enzymes break reactive compounds down into harmless water and oxygen. This reduces oxidative stress in the dinosaur's tissues, slows long-term degradation, and even helps stabilize the catalytic surfaces involved in its weapon system. At the same time, trace metals like iron and manganese consumed by the moth are redeposited onto damaged tissues, reinforcing enzyme function and structural integrity in the dinosaur's throat sacs. Radiation also plays an important role in this relationship. Portions of the moth's wing scales are rich in melanin, a pigment known to absorb ionizing radiation and bind metal ions. similar to the melanin-based system seen in radiotrophic fungi. While the moth doesn't gain energy from radiation, exposure alters the redox behavior of these pigments, improving antioxidant efficiency and helping stabilize reactive chemical byproducts in higher radiation environments like a thermo's mouth. As the moth moves across Thermoradiosaurus's body, it sheds microscopic wing scales coated in antimicrobial and metal-chelating compounds. These settle onto the dinosaur's skin and throat sacs, absorbing residual radiation and binding radiation-activated metals left behind by repeated atomic breath use. Over millions of years, what began as opportunistic feeding evolved into a deeply connected symbiotic relationship. Thermoradiosaurus benefited from reduced tissue damage, lower infection rates, and more reliable weapon function, and the moth gained a stable source of salts, trace metals, chemicals, and warmth. Understanding complex relationships, like the bond between this species and Thermoradiosaurus, takes planning, just like building a fictional world, which is exactly what the sponsor of today's video helps you do, World Anvil. World Anvil is an incredible world-building platform designed for creators who love developing deep interconnected settings. Whether you're mapping out fictional ecosystems like I do, crafting lore for your next story, or building entire cultures and histories, World Anvil gives you the tools to keep everything organized and alive. With dozens of specialized templates, you can create species profiles, timelines, and cultural write-ups that link together seamlessly. You can build interactive maps, track relationships between characters and creatures, and even lay out evolutionary paths or branching world histories. If you're into TTRPGs like me, World Anvil integrates with over 100 RPG systems, offering ready-to-use stat block templates so you can build monsters, NPCs, and entire adventures directly inside your world. So, if you want to start shaping your own universe, from complex coastal ecosystems to sprawling fantasy empires, head to worldanvil.com and use my code CreatureArchives for 51% off any yearly membership. Link is in the description below. Crucially, this relationship with Thermoradiosaurus did more than simply sustain the moth. It removed several of the physiological stresses that normally cap insect size, allowing this lineage to push far beyond the proportions of any other flying insect. Rather than providing energy directly, the symbiosis stabilized the moth's internal chemistry, reducing oxidative damage and metabolic inefficiency that would otherwise make extreme size impossible. Adult moths feed on salts, trace metals, and oxidized chemical residues found on the dinosaur's skin and within its oral tissues. These compounds function as physiological support rather than fuel. Iron and manganese act as essential cofactors for catalase, peroxidases, and related antioxidant enzymes, which are already heavily relied upon in insect flight muscles. During intense activity, especially at an extreme body size, flight muscles generate large amounts of hydrogen peroxide as a normal byproduct of aerobic metabolism. By maintaining unusually high antioxidant enzyme activity, the moth can rapidly neutralize these reactive compounds before they damage muscle fibers or neural tissue. This does not increase energy production or oxygen availability, but it significantly reduces cumulative cellular damage per flight, lowering the long-term metabolic cost of movement and allowing short-lived adults to function reliably at the upper edge of insect size and performance. Melanin-rich wing scales further bind excess metal ions and protect enzymes from oxidative degradation, while passive heat gained from resting on the dinosaur helps bring flight muscles closer to optimal operating temperature, reducing the energetic cost of takeoff. However, even with this biomechanical buffering in place, hard physical limits still had to be overcome. Insects are constrained by tracheal respiration, muscle power, and wing aerodynamics. Initially, I had considered placing the species in the Carboniferous, the era when giant insects were most abundant due to unusually high atmospheric oxygen levels that eased respiratory constraints. But because it had to coexist with Thermoradiosaurus, that wasn't an option. It had to evolve under modern oxygen levels. To meet this challenge, the moth's respiratory system had to undergo major adaptations. At first, I considered giving it a lung-like system inspired by the modern coconut crab. Coconut crabs are the largest living land arthropods, and they reach that size by replacing much of their tracheal system with a highly vascularized branchiostegial lung. This structure functions as a true gas exchange organ, allowing oxygen to enter the hemolymph and support a large slow-moving body on land where oxygen demand is relatively steady. That solution, however, breaks apart for a flying insect. Lung-based respiration depends on absorbing oxygen into the circulatory fluid and then distributing it to tissues, a process that is simply too slow and inefficient to meet the extreme localized oxygen demands of powered flight in an insect's anatomy. Insects rely on tracheae precisely because they deliver oxygen directly to flight muscles, bypassing circulation entirely. During takeoff and active wing beats, that direct delivery is essential. A lung-style system would create a bottleneck in oxygen supply and make sustained flight at this size biologically impossible. So does that mean a large flying insect breathing under modern oxygen levels is impossible? Not quite. Instead of abandoning the tracheal system, this moth retains it and pushes it to its absolute functional limit. The tracheae are expanded into large interconnected air sacs that extend deep into the thorax and abdomen, dramatically shortening diffusion distance and ensuring oxygen reaches the flight muscles precisely when demand peaks. Active abdominal pumping further enhances airflow during short bursts of intense activity, especially during takeoff. This system doesn't increase the total amount of oxygen available, but it makes oxygen delivery far more efficient at the exact moments when it matters most. Breathing, however, is only half of the problem. Even with oxygen reaching the flight muscles efficiently, the physical act of staying airborne at this scale demands a unique approach to flight itself. The wings themselves are enormous compared to its body, but they are also exceptionally lightweight. Thin, highly reinforced veins support broad membranes covered in dense melanin-rich scales that resist wear and structural breakdown. Flight muscles are concentrated in the thorax and optimized for slow, powerful wing beats rather than sustained rapid flapping. Continuous powered flight in this species is rare. Instead, the moth relies heavily on gliding, thermals, coastal wind, and elevated launch points, often taking off from cliffs, trees, or the body of its host. And once aloft, its large wings mean maintaining flight requires far less energy than the initial takeoff. The final key to this species' extreme size lies in its life cycle. Surprisingly, the basic butterfly and moth developmental blueprint lends itself to large adult sizes quite well. Lepidoptera separate growth and performance almost completely. The larval stage exists to accumulate mass and energy, while the adult stage exists primarily for reproduction and dispersal. This division dramatically reduces the physiological burden of being large. In this species, larvae spend many months feeding on mineral-rich coastal plants growing in irradiated sediments and in coastal jungles, steadily stockpiling enormous energy reserves. This prolonged larval phase acts as a biological storage period, allowing the insect to build the resources required to support a massive adult body without needing to maintain that size metabolically for long periods. Some modern Lepidoptera already demonstrate how effective this strategy can be. The Atlas moth, one of the largest moths alive today, achieves its size because its caterpillars spend weeks to months feeding intensively, while the adult moth doesn't eat at all. Once it emerges, it lives only long enough to mate and lay eggs, relying entirely on energy stored during the larval stage. This allows Atlas moths to reach sizes that would be unsustainable in insects with longer, more active adult lives. This species follows the same principle. Adults are short-lived, typically surviving only a few weeks per reproductive cycle, and invest nearly all available resources into flight, reproduction, and minimal physiological maintenance. During this brief adult stage, they dedicate a significant portion of their time to feeding on salts, trace metals, and oxidized chemical residues from Thermoradiosaurus. These compounds not only help sustain their own physiology, but are also passed down to their eggs, provisioning the next generation with these essential ingredients. Even with all of these adaptations stacked together, firm limits still remain. Under modern atmospheric conditions, the largest plausible size for this moth is a wingspan of roughly 3.5 to 4.5 meters, a body length of just over 1 meter, and a mass between 4 and 6 kilograms. While obviously nowhere near the size of an actual kaiju, this still makes this by far the largest flying insect in all of history, and the largest flying species in terms of wingspan alive today, not counting other evolved fiction creatures, of course. Pushing the limits of size and flight already brings the species to the edge of what insect biology allows, but longevity presents a final unique challenge. At this scale, oxidative damage and metabolic strain would normally make surviving beyond a single reproductive event impossible. When considering ways to overcome this and achieve a form of Mothra-style resurrection, the immortal jellyfish was the first thing that came to mind. A tiny aquatic organism capable of literally reverting to an earlier life stage to extend its lifespan. However, while fascinating, this strategy simply isn't feasible for a massive flying insect. A complete return to a juvenile stage would be too energetically costly and impractical. Instead, this lineage evolved a more biologically plausible form of controlled resurrection, a way to partially reset its physiology and extend reproductive potential without violating the limits of insect biology. After reproduction, females enter a state of post-reproductive collapse. Energy reserves are depleted, oxidative damage accumulates, and muscles and organs begin to fail. At this point, the moth can enter a secondary pupa-like phase. First, the female seeks out a shelter location. There, much like a caterpillar preparing to pupate, she spins a strong silk cocoon around herself, Within this protective structure, tissues undergo controlled breakdown and partial reorganization. Stem cell niches retained from the original pupal stage enable regeneration of gonads, flight muscles, and key enzyme systems, effectively resetting the moth's physiological clock. The process, however, isn't perfect. Memory of prior activity is largely lost, fertility is slightly reduced, and some structural tissues may not fully recover. Even so, it opens a second reproductive window, dramatically increasing lifetime reproductive success and preventing the loss of an entire generation if the first emergence occurred under unfavorable conditions. In rare cases, a moth may attempt more than one resurrection throughout its life, but each cycle carries diminishing returns as stem cell reserves and antioxidant capacity gradually declines. In the end, resurrection in the species isn't true immortality, but a unique biologically plausible way to extend reproductive potential. It showcases extreme specialization and controlled regeneration, creating a life cycle defined by renewal, mirroring the cyclical, benevolent role that makes Mothra who she is. Meet Radiogigantus immortalis, the largest flying insect to ever live. This giant lepidopteran spans 3.5 to 4.5 meters from wingtip to wingtip, with a body length of around 1 meter and a mass of 4 to 6 kilograms. Its wings are broad and heavily scaled, with deep black melanin-rich coloration accented by streaks of orange and gray. A striking large eye spot dominates each wing, providing an intimidating display capable of deterring potential predators. Its body is streamlined for flight, with a robust thorax supporting enormous wing muscles, while elongated legs allow it to cling to coastal vegetation or to the surfaces of its dinosaur host. The proboscis is long and flexible, capable of reaching salts and minerals across the uneven surfaces and hard-to-reach places of a Thermoradiosaurus's body and mouth. Overall, Immortalis combines sheer size, elegant wing structure, and dramatic coloration to create an insect that is both visually spectacular and firmly cements it as the queen of monsters. Immortalis inhabits tropical coastal regions where its dinosaur symbiont, Thermoradiosaurus colossus, regularly rest. Its preferred habitats include mangrove forest, salt-tolerant coastal vegetation, and coastal jungle lowlands. These areas provide the necessary combination of mineral-rich plant life, shelter, and proximity to its host. Eggs are laid in dense clusters on vegetation in sheltered coastal areas, favoring mangrove roots, salt-tolerant plants, and cliffside greenery where plant life is abundant and conditions near resting beaches provide protection and resources for developing larvae. They incorporate maternal antioxidants to shield developing embryos from oxidative stress and hatch within 7 to 14 days. Breeding occurs year-round in these climates, peaking during calmer, wetter seasons. Larvae spend 6 to 12 months feeding on mineral-rich plants, lichens, and irradiated biofilms, accumulating energy, antioxidant enzymes, and metal-binding proteins. Early instars are gregarious, while later stages become solitary to minimize competition. This long larval investment stage is critical, as the adult's massive size depends on the nutrients and trace elements stored during this phase. Pupation lasts 4 to 8 weeks in sheltered areas of coastal jungles, such as dense mangrove hollows, thick vegetation along the shoreline, or overhanging roots in rocky outcrops above the high tide line. The cocoons themselves are heavily reinforced with minerals and oxidized chemical residues obtained from feeding on Thermoradiosaurus, making them toxic and unpalatable to potential predators. These same compounds give the cocoons a faint bioluminescent glow, serving as a warning signal. Upon emergence, adults immediately seek out Thermoradiosaurus individuals, feeding on salts, trace metals, and oxidized chemical residues found on the dinosaur's skin and within its mouth. This chemical intake is essential, supporting flight, tissue maintenance, and antioxidant systems, while simultaneously benefiting the dinosaur by reducing oxidative tissue damage and depositing antimicrobial compounds. Adults are short-lived, typically living 2 to 4 weeks per reproductive cycle, and their activity is tightly coordinated with the availability of chemical resources from the host. Mating typically occurs on coastal plants or even directly on Thermoradiosaurus individuals. Females release pheromones once they have accumulated sufficient minerals and chemical compounds from the host, signaling readiness to reproduce. After laying a single large clutch of eggs, adults enter a physiological state of post-reproductive tissue remodeling. Those with adequate chemical reserves can undergo partial tissue regeneration and muscle repair, enabling a second reproductive opportunity. This capability, combined with their specialized chemical diet and symbiosis, ensures reproductive success even under challenging environmental conditions. Every stage of Immortalis's life cycle, from larva through adult, is intimately shaped by coastal habitat resources and its mutualistic relationship with Thermoradiosaurus. Without access to the host, adults struggle to maintain oxidative balance or maximize reproductive output, illustrating the intricate evolutionary and ecological dependence of this species on its dinosaur partner. Unlike its more aggressive dinosaur partner, Immortalis survived into the modern era without posing any direct threat to humans. Its size, resurrection ability, and bioluminescent cocoons made it a striking presence along tropical coast, inspiring myths of winged gods, spirits, and omens. Unlike predatory species, humans were never forced to fear it. Instead, they sought to understand, harvest, and occasionally keep it as a marvel. Coastal civilizations quickly discovered that discarded cocoons contained mineral-rich, chemically stabilized silk. The silk was not only toxic to predators and faintly bioluminescent, but also was incredibly strong, far surpassing the tensile strength of most naturally occurring fibers. As a result, it became highly prized for both practical and ceremonial purposes. Indigenous cultures in Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific used cocoon fibers to create durable clothing, ropes, fishing nets, and intricate ritual garments, while also incorporating fragments into talismans and decorative ornaments. The glowing quality of the cocoons at night likely contributed to early folklore portraying Immortalis as protective, benevolent spirits. Wing scales shed by adults were also valued. Containing metal ions and antimicrobial peptides, they were occasionally powdered for use in medicinal remedies or as a preservative additive for food and leather. In the late medieval period, attempts were made to maintain small populations of Immortalis in controlled environments, particularly in coastal gardens and enclosed mangrove plots. However, their short adult lifespan and dependence on chemical residues from Thermoradiosaurus limited success. But careful mimicry of these conditions allowed a few individuals to complete a full life cycle. These living curiosities became prized features of exotic gardens and temples. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, naturalists and entomologists began documenting Immortalis extensively. Observers were fascinated by its unusual relationship with Thermoradiosaurus, noting how the moths relied on the dinosaurs for critical minerals and chemical compounds. Researchers collected samples of their cocoons to investigate the source of the remarkable strength and faint bioluminescence. Chemical analysis revealed high concentrations of iron, manganese, and other trace metals, which not only reinforced the silk, but also contributed to its glowing properties. These studies marked some of the earliest attempts to understand how a flying insect of such enormous size could survive and maintain its unique physiology. Immortalis is currently classified as endangered on the IUCN Red List. Its restricted tropical coastal range, highly specialized ecological niche, and dependence on a dwindling Thermoradiosaurus population make it extremely vulnerable to habitat degradation. Modern conservation efforts focus on protecting both the moth and its dinosaur host, safeguarding radiation-rich sands, mangrove ecosystems, and coastal niches essential for the species' survival. Throughout history, humans have interacted with Immortalis with reverence and scientific curiosity. Its non-aggressive nature, stunning appearance, and remarkable resurrection ability have made the species both an icon of nature's wonders and a global symbol of peace and renewal. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss any future content. And if you want to further support the channel, consider becoming a YouTube member today. You'll help me create the highest quality content possible while also gaining early access to videos, sneak peeks at upcoming projects, and entry to the members-only section of the Creature Archives Discord. A huge thank you to all my current members. Your support is what makes this channel possible. Until next time, stay curious, and I'll see you all in the next video.